It was a moonlit night over England, the kind of night that carried both calm and tension in the air. You could almost hear the pulse of the earth waiting for what was about to unfold. At a small airfield called Scampton, engines growled in the distance, men smoked in silence, and the weight of an impossible mission hung over every face. No one there knew if they'd live to see the morning, but they all knew one thing: what they were about to attempt could change the course of the war. This was Operation Chastise, better known to history as the Dambusters raid. And it wasn't just another bombing run, it was madness forged into strategy. Science turned into weaponry, and courage pushed far beyond reason. Before we go any further, if you love stories like this, real human tales behind the machines, the missions, and the men who flew into the impossible, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like and share it with your friends who can't get enough of history that actually breathes. It helps more than you know. Now, let's go back to that night, May 16th, 1943. Britain had been at war for nearly 4 years. The German war machine was running full tilt, its industries churning out tanks, guns, and aircraft faster than the Allies could destroy them. Deep in the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, stood the Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe dams. Massive, fortress-like structures of concrete and stone that powered steelworks, fed canals, and sustained factories across the region. To hit Germany where it hurt, the Allies needed to strike these dams. But there was a problem: traditional bombing runs couldn't touch them. They were too strong, too heavily defended, and surrounded by flak guns that could tear any plane to pieces before it got close enough. That's where a man named Barnes Wallace came in. An engineer, not a soldier. A quiet genius who believed that if you hit a dam at just the right point, with just the right weapon, the pressure of water itself could do the rest. Wallace came up with a revolutionary idea: bomb that would bounce across the water. Like a skipping stone, strike the dam wall, sink to a set depth, and then explode with devastating force. It sounded like fantasy, but he was convinced it would work. He built models, tested theories, and argued his case through endless bureaucratic walls until finally he got a chance to prove it. Imagine that, a bomb that skips. To pull it off, you needed perfect precision. The plane had to fly just 60 feet above the water at exactly 230 miles per hour, and release the bomb at a pinpoint distance from the targetor while being shot at by German guns and flying in the dark. It was insane. Even Wallace knew it. But war breeds desperation, and Britain was desperate. When the Royal Air Force approved the operation, they needed pilots who could fly like their lives depended on it. Men with steady hands, cold nerves, and the kind of courage that didn't crack under fire. They formed a new squadron, 617 Squadron, led by a man named Wing Commander Guy Gibson. Only 24 years old, yet already a veteran of over 170 missions. A perfectionist, calm and exacting, Gibson demanded the same level of excellence from his men. They trained for weeks in total secrecy, flying at treetop level across reservoirs and lakes, practicing low-altitude approaches so dangerous that a single mistake meant death every night. They flew over British waters, their bombers' wingtips nearly touching the surface, learning to hold steady against wind, and darkness. It wasn't long before the crews began to realize just how mad this mission really was. Some called it a suicide run. Others didn't say anything at all, they just kept flying, because that's what they'd been trained to do. The aircraft that would carry out the raid was the Avro Lancaster, one of the finest heavy bombers of the war. But to fit the new bomb, massive modifications were made. The bomb bay doors were removed entirely, and a huge rotating mechanism was installed underneath to spin the bouncing bomb backwards. Before release, that backspin was crucial. It kept the bomb hugging the water, skipping smoothly instead of tumbling. Inside, engineers worked with stopwatches and lights to calculate everything down to the second. The bomb itself was codenamed Upkeep, though the men who carried it often just called it that damn thing. By the afternoon of May 16th, everything was ready. The crews were briefed, the routes memorized, the nerves running thin. Gibson addressed his men in the mess hall, standing calm and composed, though everyone could see the tension in his eyes. "It's going to be a tough night," he said. "Some of us won't come back, but if we succeed, it could shorten the war." No one said a word. They didn't need to dot at 9:28 that night. The first wave of Lancasters began to take off. The roar of the Merlin engines shook the airfield as one by one the great bombers lifted into the night sky, heavy and slow at first, then steady and sure, climbing toward their rendezvous points. From the ground, they looked like fireflies drifting eastward into the darkness. From inside the cockpits, all you could see were the black shapes of the English countryside racing by just feet below. They had to stay low beneath radar, beneath enemy detection. They skimmed over trees, power lines, and villages so close they could see people's faces in the windows. For hours, they flew across occupied Europe, dodging searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries. One aircraft was hit crossing the Dutch coast. Another clipped a treetop and vanished in a burst of flame. Still, the others pressed on. Each crew knew that precision was everything. If they were too high, the bomb would break apart. Too low, and the plane would crash before even reaching the dam. When they finally approached the Ruhr, the glow of the industrial valley lit up the sky. Smoke, fires, factory lights. It was like flying into the mouth of a beast. The first target, the men dam, Gibson led the attack himself. His Lancaster, call sign G. George, descended until its wingtips almost brushed the water. Two spotlights beneath the fuselage intersected at exactly 60 feet, giving the bomb aimer the perfect cue for altitude. They came in fast, straight, steady. German searchlights snapped on, tracers laced the air, and flak burst around them like thunder. Gibson held course at the release point. The bomb dropped cleanly, bouncing 3 times across the reservoir before striking the dam wall and sinking. A few seconds later, the night exploded. The shock wave hit the Lancaster like a fist, rocking it violently. When the smoke cleared, the dam still stood, though cracks were visible along its base. Gibson circled, calling in the next crew. One by one, the bombers came in, each run more dangerous than the last. One aircraft was hit and crashed into the valley below. Another's bomb skipped to high and detonated early, showering debris across the water. But they kept coming. Finally, On the fifth run, Pilot Officer David Maltby lined up perfectly. His bomb struck true, rolled down the wall, and detonated right at the base. The main dam cracked, then gave way. A roar like the end of the world followed. A wall of water surged forward, hundreds of feet high, crashing through the valley and sweeping away everything in its path: villages, bridges, rail lines. Even the German defenses were caught completely off guard. In a matter of minutes, the might of industrial Germany's heartland was drowning in its own power. Gibson didn't celebrate. There was still another target to hit the Eder Dam, but reaching it meant flying deeper into enemy territory, over mountainous terrain and narrow valleys where radar was useless, and moonlight barely touched the ground. The crews had to find their way by instinct, by the shape of the land beneath them. It was after midnight when they finally sighted the Eder Reservoir. The water shimmered faintly under the moon, but the approach was impossible from most directions. The valley was tight, surrounded by steep hills. Only one narrow line of attack offered a chance, and even that required threading the aircraft through a hairpin turn at low altitude. Gibson and his men made several passes, studying the angles, searching for a way in. Then, Pilot Officer Les Knight took the lead. He came in low, his engines howling, dropped the bomb perfectly, and pulled up hard. The explosion hit seconds later, and this time, the dam broke clean in half, to targets destroyed, to symbols of German industry brought to their knees. For the men who survived that night, it felt like they'd done the impossible. But as dawn broke and they turned back toward England, the weight of what they'd lost began to sink in. Of the 19 bombers that had taken off, 8 would never return. 53 men were gone. Before we move further into what happened after the raid, the German reaction, the propaganda, the debate over whether it was worth the cost, take a moment to support this channel. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button. Subscribe for more true WWII tales told with heart. And drop a comment sharing your thoughts about the bravery of those crews. It keeps this history alive. When the surviving Lancasters returned to England, the sun was already rising. The long, pale light of early morning stretched over the airfield at Scampton as the first aircraft came in. Low and weary, engines sputtering, paint scorched with shrapnel marks. Ground crews and fellow airmen waited in silence, counting each returning silhouette in the sky, hoping, praying for more. One by one, they landed, their wheels thudding onto the runway. The silence that followed was deafening. Men leaned out of cockpits with hollow eyes, faces gray with exhaustion and disbelief. Gibson was among the first to climb out. He didn't say much, just nodded to the crews, gave a few quick words, and walked off toward headquarters. He knew what everyone else would learn soon enough. Nearly half his squadron hadn't made it back. Out of 133 men who took off that night, 53 were dead and 3 were captured. 8 planes lost. It was a terrible price. Yet, when the reports came in from Germany, the magnitude of what they'd achieved became clear. The Men and Eder dams were gone. The floods had ripped through the Ruhr Valley, cutting power to steelworks, railways, and munitions factories. Bridges collapsed, power stations were destroyed, and thousands of acres of farmland were ruined. In total, Over 1,000 people had been killed, many of them civilians and forced laborers working in the valley. It was destruction on a scale no one had fully anticipated. The British press exploded with the story. Dams burst in Germany. The headlines read, "The public hailed the Dambusters as heroes, symbols of ingenuity and courage." King George VI awarded Guy Gibson the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor. Barnes Wallis, the quiet engineer who had dreamed the whole idea into being, was both celebrated and haunted. When he learned of the number of airmen who hadn't returned, he wept. He had believed so deeply in the mission's purpose, but had never imagined it would cost so many young lives. "I didn't want them to die," he later said. "I just wanted to help end the war." In the days that followed, German engineers rushed to assess the damage. The scale of flooding stunned them. The Main Reservoir had emptied completely, and the Eder Valley was buried in mud and debris. Hydroelectric power was gone for weeks. Water supplies were disrupted, and hundreds of factories were temporarily paralyzed. Yet, the Germans were nothing if not efficient. Within days, repair crews were on site, thousands of workers mobilized, and by late summer, the dams were largely restored. The actual long-term impact on German production turned out to be less devastating than the Allies had hoped. But even if the physical results were temporary, the psychological effect was enormous. The German people, who had been told their homeland was safe behind its defenses, suddenly realized that nowhere was untouchable. The Allies had found a way to strike deep inside Germany with uncanny precision. And for the British, who had endured years of bombings and setbacks, it was a rare and much-needed victory. Back at Scampton, the mood was complex pride mixed with grief. Those who had flown the mission were hailed across Britain. Yet they couldn't shake the memory of empty chairs in the mess hall. Guy Gibson himself, though awarded and praised, carried the loss heavily. He kept a list of every man he'd lost on the raid, writing small notes beside each name. Months later, he was promoted, given staff duties, and sent to tour the United States, talking about British air tactics. But he never quite got over that night. The strain of command, the memory of friends gone, those things don't fade easily. Let's talk about what made that mission so remarkable from a technical point of view. Because it wasn't just bravery, it was a masterpiece of engineering and flying skill. The bomb, upkeep, was essentially a massive cylinder weighing over 9,000 pounds. To make it bounce correctly, it had to spin backward at about 500 revolutions per minute. That spin was achieved using a small electric motor inside the aircraft, powered by the plane's hydraulic system. As the bomb was dropped, the backspin made it skip over the surface, staying low and stable. When it struck the dam, it rolled down the wall, sinking to about 30 feet before a hydrostatic fuse triggered the explosion. That depth was crucial, deep enough for the water pressure to magnify the blast against the concrete. All of this depended on absolute precision. The Lancasters had no radar altimeters, so the crews used two-angled spotlights mounted under the fuselage. When the beams met in a single circle on the water's surface, they knew they were exactly 60 feet above. For distance, the bomb aimers used a simple wooden triangular sight calibrated for the width of the dam's towers. It was crude, handmade even, but it worked. That combination of old-fashioned ingenuity and raw skill was what made 617 Squadron legendary. And that's something I've always admired about these men. They weren't superheroes or flawless machines. They were young, most of them in their early 20s, flying on the edge of death, in aircraft built by the hands of workers who knew their sons might be inside. They were ordinary men given extraordinary tasks, and they did them because someone had to. After the raid, 617 Squadron continued to evolve. They became specialists in precision bombing, using new types of weapons like the 12,000-pound tall boy and later the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, the so-called earthquake bombs, also designed by Barnes-Wallis. These could shatter bunkers and viaducts that no conventional bomb could touch. Under different commanders, the squadron attacked U-boat pens, V-weapon sites, and even the battleship Tirpitz in a Norwegian fjord, sinking it after 3 daring attacks. But it all started with the Dam's raid. That was their baptism of fire, their defining moment. The German propaganda machine, of course, tried to spin the event as minor. They claimed the damage was exaggerated, that production hadn't suffered, that morale was untouched. But internal reports told another story. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments, later admitted that for weeks after the raid, chaos reigned in the Ruhr. Power lines were down, transportation crippled, and hundreds of workers diverted from war production to emergency repairs. He said, "It was a disaster for us, and we did not wish to admit it." It's hard to imagine what it must have felt like inside those cockpits that night. The noise, the vibration, the smell of oil and sweat, the tracers flashing past. One navigator later recalled, "We flew so low the trees were brushing the belly of the plane. You didn't think about fear, you just did your job." That's the thing about those crews, they operated in a strange balance between terror and focus. The danger was so constant it became normal. When news of the raid spread across Allied air bases, other squadrons looked at 617 with awe. They weren't regular bombers anymore, they were the precision strike unit. The ones who could hit a bridge or a dam when others couldn't even find it on the radar. They'd carved a legend in one night. But legends come at a price. Gibson lost many of the men he considered family. And just a year later, in September 1944, he himself was killed in action, his Mosquito crashing in Holland while returning from a mission. The Dambuster who'd led from the front, gone before the war was even over. Barnes-Wallis outlived the war, but he carried its ghosts. He kept his notebooks, drawings, and letters from the men he'd worked with. In interviews, you could still see the sadness in his eyes when he talked about Operation Chastise. He said it was his proudest achievement, but also his heaviest burden. That paradox defines so much of wartime innovation. The brilliance that saves some lives always seems to cost others. When the war ended, the story of the Dambusters became immortalized in books, in films, in that unforgettable music that still stirs hearts today. Yet, beneath the legend, the truth remains deeply human. It was a mission of courage, but also of sacrifice. A triumph of engineering, but one written in blood. If you're still with me, Give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Comment below, what do you think drove those men to keep flying into the unknown? Was it duty, camaraderie, or just survival? And share this video with someone who loves true stories from history's skies. Every bit of support helps keep these voices alive for future generations. In the days after the raid, the German countryside was a scene of devastation. The once quiet valleys of the Ruhr had become inland seas. Whole villages were gone, washed away in a tide of steel-grey water. Survivors stood on muddy banks, staring at where their homes used to be. Bridges hung broken, railway lines twisted like paper, and debris farm carts, timbers, even entire roofs floated downstream. The floods reached as far as the WWII River, carrying with them a grim reminder that war had long stopped. Being something that happened somewhere else. For the German military, the raid was a shock. The dams had been seen as untouchable. Their destruction not only disrupted production, it exposed a vulnerability no one wanted to admit. Albert Speer visited the Möhne Valley himself, seeing the wreckage with his own eyes. He later wrote that it was one of the few times during the war when he truly felt Germany might lose. The water had crippled transport routes, drowned factories, and forced thousands to abandon their work to help rebuild. For weeks, the heart of the industrial region, the very lifeblood of the Nazi war machine, beat slower. But Germany's engineers were relentless. Within days, plans were drawn up for repairs. Concrete poured around the clock. Soldiers and forced laborers working side by side under guard. The priority was absolute: restore power, restore production, restore control. By late September, both the Möhne and Eder dams were functioning again. They couldn't undo the psychological blow, but they could prove that Germany could still recover, still resist. The war machine, though bruised, marched on. Back in Britain, the Dambusters became instant legends. They were paraded before cameras, honored at banquets, interviewed by the press. But anyone who looked closely could see the strain behind the smiles. Most of them were too young to handle fame, and all of them carried memories they'd rather forget. Guy Gibson, the squadron's stoic leader, became the face of British heroism. He was everywhere: photographs, speeches, official tours. Yet privately, he was haunted. In letters to close friends, he wrote about his guilt, how he couldn't stop thinking about the men who hadn't come home. The applause felt hollow. Barnes Wallace, too, was deeply conflicted. He'd proved his theories spectacularly, but the cost weighed on him. When he met the surviving crews at Scampton after the raid, witnesses recalled him breaking down, his head in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The airmen comforted him, not the other way around. He would later devote his post-war career to creating safer designs aircraft that could reduce casualties instead of multiplying them. 617 Squadron, meanwhile, became something else entirely. After Operation Chastise, they were transformed from an experiment into a precision strike unit. Their motto, Apes Moala Deluge, after me, the flood, was no longer symbolic. Under new leadership, they went on to deliver the Tall Boy and Grand Slam bombs, also designed by Wallace, on some of the most critical targets of the war. They shattered the Sorpe railway tunnel in France, collapsed V-weapon bunkers on the coast, and crippled the battleship turrets the pride of the German fleet, hidden in the Norwegian fjords. 617 became the surgical knife of the RAF, feared and respected across the front. Still, the dam's raid remained their defining chapter. Nothing before or after matched its audacity. The courage it demanded wasn't just in flying low through gunfire, it was in believing that something so seemingly impossible could even work. Many who flew that night said they never felt the same again. One recalled looking down at the flood that followed and realizing he'd witnessed a weapon greater than any bomb. Let's pause a moment and think about what made these men different. They weren't better than others, not braver by birth. They were trained, yes, disciplined, yes, but what set them apart was trust. Trust in one another, trust in their leader, trust in a mad idea from a quiet engineer who dared to think differently. Every bounce of that bomb, every narrow escape from a flak burst, every desperate maneuver over enemy searchlights, all of it came from a shared faith that they were doing something that mattered. Guy Gibson didn't live to see the end of the war. In September 1944, during a night mission over the Netherlands, his Mosquito crashed under mysterious circumstances. Some said he was shot down by German fire. Others believed his plane simply ran out of fuel. Whatever the cause, Britain lost one of its finest airmen. He was 26 years old. The country mourned him as a national hero. His Victoria Cross and logbooks became relics. His name forever tied to the legend of the Dambusters. The survivors carried on quietly. After the war, many returned to civilian life. Pilots became engineers, navigators became teachers, gunners became farmers. Some stayed in aviation, others disappeared into ordinary jobs. A few refused to talk about the raid ever again. The memories were too sharp, too heavy. At reunions years later, they'd drink together and swap small stories. But when the conversation turned to that night, there'd be long pauses. One veteran said, "You can't explain what it was like. You either came back or you didn't. That's all there is to it." In Germany, the scars of the raid remained visible for decades. The Möhne Dam was rebuilt stronger than ever, but locals still told stories of the flood. The graves of civilians and foreign laborers who died in the deluge became quiet memorials to the cost of war's ingenuity. For them, the raid wasn't heroism, it was tragedy. History rarely gives simple answers. Every victory comes with another side of grief. Years later, when the war had faded into memory, the Dambusters' story was retold on film. The 1955 movie The Dambusters captured the mission's spirit with remarkable accuracy, using many of the actual airmen as consultants. The film immortalized the bouncing bomb and that haunting score that swells with pride and melancholy all at once. But even that movie couldn't capture the real fear, the loss, or the moments of silence in the mess hall afterward. What it did do, though, was cement the raid as one of the most daring operations in aviation history, a perfect balance of science, skill, and sheer nerve. I remember meeting one of the old Dambusters decades later at a small museum near Lincolnshire. He was frail by then, his uniform jacket hanging loosely on thin shoulders. But when he spoke about that night, his eyes lit up like a young man's. He described the moment the bomb left the plane, the tension before the explosion, the blinding flash when the dam broke. Then he paused and said quietly, "We were just doing our job. We didn't think we'd be remembered." And that, I think, is what separates true heroism from myth. They never sought glory, they simply answered the call. It's easy, sitting here today, to romanticize it all, the roaring engines, the floodwaters, the triumph. But behind every roar was fear. Behind every medal, there was someone missing. The Dambusters raid wasn't just a victory. It was a mirror showing both the brilliance and the brutality of human invention. If you're still here listening, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who'd appreciate the courage and sacrifice behind this story. And tell me in the comments, what do you think? Were the Dambusters right to take such risks for a symbolic strike? Or was it a higher price to pay? Your thoughts matter. They keep this history alive and honest. In the years that followed the war, the legacy of the Dambusters began to take on a life of its own. The men who had flown that night were scattered across England, most of them trying to slip quietly back into civilian life. But they could never quite escape what they had done. The newspapers called them legends. The public saw them as symbols of British ingenuity and courage. But for the airmen themselves, it wasn't something they bragged about. When people asked what it was like, they'd just smile faintly and say, "It was noisy," or "We were lucky." They had lived through something that words couldn't really touch. Guy Gibson's name was written into every history book, his face printed on posters and covers for years afterward. The RAF used his story as a rallying cry for discipline and bravery. Yet those who knew him best remembered the quieter version, the man who would sit alone with his dog, flipping through mission logs, lost in thought. When his Victoria Cross was presented to his widow, she wept not out of pride, but because she knew he'd have given it back in exchange for the men he'd lost. That was Gibson's way. He didn't see glory, he saw ghosts. Barnes Wallis, on the other hand, continued his life's work with the same restless mind that had dreamed up the bouncing bomb. He went on to design the Tallboy and Grand Slam, the largest conventional bombs ever dropped at the time, and even experimented with supersonic aircraft designs long before the jet age matured. But he never forgot that night in 1943. There's a famous photograph of him years later, standing by the Main Dam, rebuilt and calm, the water smooth and quiet again. He's older, thinner, holding his hat in both hands, staring at the wall that had once crumbled beneath the weight of his idea. You can almost see the question in his eyes. Was it worth it? Operation Chastise changed the way wars were fought. Before that night, precision bombing was a dream, a theory. But 617 Squadron proved that, with the right mix of training, engineering, and sheer nerve, you could hit specific, high-value targets without leveling entire cities. It was the beginning of what we now call surgical strikes. The lessons learned from that mission fed directly into later operations, the destruction of viaducts, submarine pens, and missile bases. It was the birth of modern precision warfare, though at a terrible cost. Even decades later, the techniques they pioneered were still studied. In Cold War classrooms, RAF cadets were taught how 617's low-level navigation had rewritten the rules of air assault. American engineers studying smart bombs and laser guidance in the Vietnam era cited Barnes Wallace's work as an early inspiration. The idea that accuracy mattered as much as power, that was his legacy. But beyond the technology and tactics, what endured most was the story's humanity. The image of those young men flying into the dark, trusting one another completely, remains timeless. They weren't fighting for medals. They weren't driven by hatred. They were driven by duty and by faith in something larger than themselves. That spirit is what continues to draw people to their story generation after generation. Every May, on the anniversary of the raid, veterans and families would gather at Scampton. They'd stand by the memorial, the names of the fallen carved in stone, and watch a Lancaster from the Battle of Britain Memorial flight pass overhead. The deep, steady hum of its Merlin engines echoed across the fields, and for a few moments, everyone was silent. It wasn't triumph they felt, it was remembrance. You could see it in the old men's eyes, watery and bright, their hands trembling slightly as they saluted. For them, the war had never really ended, and that's something I think about often. Time has a way of softening the edges of history, of turning flesh and fear into legend. But when you listen to the last Dambusters talk, you realize they never saw themselves as heroes. One of them, George Johnny Johnson, who lived past 100, once said in an interview, "We were just doing what was asked. The heroes are the ones who didn't come back." That humility, that quiet acceptance, is what makes their stories so powerful. As the years passed, the squadron itself kept evolving. The Dambusters' name lived on through new generations of pilots flying different aircraft, Vulcans, Tornadoes, and later F-35s. Their insignia still bears the lightning bolt over water, a nod to the dams they once destroyed. And even now, when a 617 Squadron plane takes off, there's a trace of that same spirit from 1943 in the way the crews carried themselves, calm, precise, professional, but with that glint of daring in their eyes. If you ever visit the Möhne or Eder dams today, you'd never guess the destruction that once unfolded there. The water lies still, tourists walk along the rebuilt walls, and the air is peaceful. But beneath the surface, the ghosts remain. Divers still find fragments of the original upkeep bombs resting in the silt. Locals still tell stories passed down from parents and grandparents who remembered the flood. It's a place where history feels alive, like the earth itself remembers. I once stood there myself, years ago. The dam stretched wide and solid before me, the air crisp, the water glassy under a pale German sky. It was hard to imagine those thunderous explosions, the walls cracking, the torrents rushing down. But as I watched, I thought of those young men in their Lancasters, flying low through flak and tracer fire, hearts pounding, breath shallow, holding the line between genius and death. I thought of Gibson's quiet courage, Wallace's restless mind, and the hundreds of unnamed hands that built and rebuilt these walls of stone and memory. History doesn't always shout, it sometimes whispers, softly, from the ripples of a calm reservoir. The Dambusters raid wasn't a flawless success. It didn't cripple Germany as the planners had hoped. But it did something deeper. It showed that imagination could be a weapon. That even in the darkest moments of war, the human mind could still dream, still innovate, still believe in the impossible. That's the lesson that outlasts the rubble and the medals. Before we move to our final part, take a second to make sure you're subscribed to this channel. If stories like this move you, share this video with a friend who loves real history, the kind that makes you feel something. Leave a comment below about what part of the Dambusters story struck you most. Was it the invention, the courage, or the cost? I read everyone. History remembers the Dambusters as heroes. But if you look closely, their story is more than a tale of bravery. It's a meditation on human limits. What happens when genius meets destruction? When courage meets consequence? That's what gives Operation Chastise its lasting power. After the war, as Europe rebuilt, there were quiet debates about whether the raid had been worth it. Yes, the dams were breached, but the human toll was staggering. Over 1,300 people died in the floods, many of them civilians, including women and children, and hundreds of forced laborers from occupied countries. Even Barnes Wallis, the man who designed the bomb, was haunted by that fact for the rest of his life. In his diaries, he wrote about sleepless nights, about how he'd imagined only the dams collapsing, not the lives swept away beneath them. He called it the price of war, but it never sat easily with him, and that's the uncomfortable truth. The Dambusters raid wasn't black and white. It was a moral gray zone, one of those moments where brilliance and brutality coexist. The operation didn't end the war, but it proved something to the world, that even in 1943, when Britain was battered and exhausted, its people could still strike a blow that echoed across continents. It was psychological as much as physical, a message to Germany and to the Allies themselves. That innovation could still turn the tide. The men who flew that night knew none of that when they climbed into their planes. They didn't think about the politics or the headlines. They thought about each other. Every veteran who survived said the same thing. It wasn't the mission they remembered most. It was the faces beside them in the cockpit glow, the smell of oil and leather, the way their hearts pounded as the altimeter dropped to 60 feet over black water. Those moments bound them tighter than any medal ever could. Decades later, when filmmakers recreated the raid for the 1955 movie The Dambusters, the surviving airmen gathered to watch. Some smiled, some cried quietly. The film captured the camaraderie, the daring, but not the fear. How could it? How do you show what it feels like to fly into flak so dense it looks like a thunderstorm? Made of fire? One veteran reportedly turned to another and said, "We were mad, weren't we?" The other just nodded. Completely. Barnes Wallis lived long enough to see humanity move from propellers to jet engines to the dawn of space flight. Yet even then, when people praised him as a visionary, he'd always steer the conversation back to the men who had flown his invention. "It wasn't my bomb that made history," he once said. "It was their courage." Guy Gibson never got to see the peace he helped win. His death in 1944, shot down while returning from another mission, felt like the closing of a chapter. When news reached his old squadron, they didn't hold speeches or ceremonies. They simply raised a glass in the mess, fell silent for a moment, and then got back to work. That's what he would have wanted. The years have thinned their ranks, but the Dambusters' name endures. Every pilot who's worn the 617 Squadron badge knows what it represents, not just daring, but discipline, precision, and the willingness to do the impossible under impossible odds. Whether flying the Vulcan bombers of the Cold War or today's F-35 Lightning jets, they carry a legacy written not just in history books, but in the DNA of aviation itself. The roar of those Lancaster engines has long faded from the skies, but their echo remains in museums, in the still waters of the Ruhr, and in the hearts of those who understand what that night meant. Not just a victory, but a question that still hangs in the air. What do we owe to those who risk everything, knowing they may not come back? If you ever stand by the memorial at Scampton, where the names of the fallen are carved in stone, you'll notice something. There's no mention of victory or triumph, just names. Young men, most in their early 20s, who flew into the dark because someone had to. That's their true legacy. War makes legends, but time makes them human again. The Dambusters weren't supermen. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances, doing their job with quiet resolve. Their story reminds us that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about flying straight into the storm, afraid, but going anyway. And maybe that's why, even now, over 80 years later, we still tell their story. Because in a world that often celebrates power, the Dambusters remind us of something deeper: the cost of ingenuity, the price of bravery, and the enduring strength of human spirit. So next time you hear the steady hum of a Merlin engine at an air show, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the moonlight on the reservoirs, the tracers in the sky, the voices crackling over the intercom. And remember those who took off into the night with nothing but faith, skill, and a heartbeat between life and legend. That's the story of the Dambusters. A story not of bombs and dams, but of men flawed, brilliant, brave, and the night when courage defied gravity itself. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, take a second to subscribe. Share it with someone who believes history should still be felt, not just remembered. Until next time, keep their memory flying.